I've been getting into gardening recently, and one of the weirdest parts of it is the odd horror moments you accidentally create growing your own plants and vegetables. I've got a soft heart, so any ladybirds or bees that end up on anything I pick up end up getting gently carried back on a leaf to their homestead. Though it's quite a sweet moment for me, I often think it has to be a pretty horrific moment for whatever poor unfortunate insect finds itself on my fronds, as a colossal giant who's otherwise ignored them suddenly carries them worlds away from where they were, spots them, seems to try to communicate with them, and then grabs them in its giant paw, only to drop them right back where they started. It's a silly thing to think about, but I've often also thought it's the closest I'll probably, or hopefully, ever come to being a Cthulhu-esque monster. Even though my intentions are good, or at least to treat a creature whose life is much shorter and different to my own with kindness, it's impossible to communicate that to an ant, and I'm sure majorly distressing for any insect it happens to. Funnily enough, my thoughts about this whole matter are something that's constantly come up during my time playing Look Outside, and experiencing the striking story of a game and world wherein every living creature that's been unfortunate to do as the title says have been transformed by a Lovecraftian beast whose motivations are a mystery to most of the characters in its narrative. I think Look Outside would still be a good story, and still one of my favourite games of all time, if this creature, the Visitor, was made out to be a malicious or uncaring entity who on some level either wishes for the downfall of humanity or cares not for humanity at all whatsoever. However, I believe the plot of Look Outside makes a more interesting concept for this entity and its story clear. Namely, that its intentions weren't as egregiously awful as it might seem looking at the effect it had on those we meet, and that, on some level, it truly wants to help humanity. This makes the absolutely unhinged horrors you experience throughout the 15 days of Look Outside's story in some ways far more horrific than would otherwise have been in any way possible, since it kicks off a story that explores the nightmarish concept of being a small creature entirely at the whim of a larger, mind-boggling entity whose efforts to understand you and what you want are accidentally ruining your life. Unless you want to become a living crocodile cereal mascot. Please don't answer that. The interesting thing about the way Look Outside is constructed is that the enemies you face, or the entities you meet in general, tend to get steadily more and more abstract as you go on, unless you're able to do some speedrun pro strats wherein you're able to get to the heart of the game in short order. However, this still happens a lot faster than you might expect, as you go from regular horror movie spooksters with some extra eyes or teeth, to someone wherein the main horror of their design is that they were human once, pretty dang quick. One of the best early examples of how getting what you want isn't always what you need in the game comes with one of the most interesting party members you can get in the game, namely Leigh, who you can recruit by beating her monstrous form after she chases you down and tries to kill you for the cardinal sin of nabbing some keys left on the floor. Leigh is obsessed with strength, and with the prospect of proving herself against Sam after you beat her. Initially, it seems like this is just part of how her transformation into a person who can become a creepy, multi-limbed beastie might have affected her. However, the game offers an alternative explanation, as following Leigh's personal quest, by finding the abandoned cell phone left on the ground floor and charging it, reveals that not all that long before the events of the game, Leigh had a boyfriend who did something they themselves say violated Leigh's trust, leading to the pair not speaking for months before the timeline of Look Outside takes place. Right before the Visitor arrives near Earth, Leigh also appears to have some kind of conflict with her family, based on the text from her loved ones we can read in the story. With this context in mind, Leigh's desire to feel and be strong, and her subsequent transformation, look a little bit different. Notably, when asked why she cut everyone out of her life, Leigh tells you that "I'm someone else now, the person I've always wanted to be," and expands by stating, "I'm tired of daydreaming about being strong. Now I am strong, and do what I want." While you get the chance to tell your complex, bloodthirsty new pal she can be Leigh and the Beast at the end of her quest, which nets you a nifty power-up wherein she has a little more control over her alternate self, even a more balanced version of the character still seems to feel as though the Lovecraftian horrors that altered her form in horrific ways for good did exactly what she wanted. And honestly, in a lot of ways, it appears it did just that. Interestingly, it's worth noting we also learn that Leigh's former partner Martin nicknamed Leigh Grasshopper. Firstly, because you know there's a weird story behind someone getting a nickname like Grasshopper, and because we later see that the Grasshopper nickname instead now suits him better, given it appears Leigh's ex has transformed into a grasshopper, which could be interpreted as the most important thing in his life, having been his bond with Leigh and hopes to reconnect with her, especially taking into account that he texts her before his insectoid transformation to say he still loves her, and writes a relatively heartfelt letter about still loving her also, which he leaves alongside a ring he wanted to give her. Now, if it was just Leigh and the unlucky grasshopper that seemed to have a twisted version of their desires affect how they were changed by looking outside and seeing the visitor, that would be one thing. However, that very much doesn't seem to be the case. While there are definitely characters whose transformations don't seem to be linked to their own desires or goals, if only because I don't think there's any way to interpret what happens to poor old Michael as what he likely wanted, since he's a massive mouths and meat that seemingly can't do anything. Most figures in the game work along these lines. Some of the most obvious examples come in the form of people being altered in a way that aligns with their hobbies or obsessions. Though Lyle is a little sensitive about his new form, which is sort of like if a camera and a beetle fell in love and created an unholy, photographically gifted offspring, it matches up perfectly with his obsession with cameras and photography, and stalking, and lets him get personally involved in these fields in a way he never could before. Louis's transformation of Floor Up is pretty similar in this sense, as the character's complex love of the cereal brand Choco Rocks, which has seen him create an original character, loosely based off the mascot named Fiber Dragon, is what leads to him being bonded with the suit, which is something Louis seems to actively want to happen on some level, right up until he realizes it has in fact already become reality, as a result of him going outside wearing the suit, hoping he'd perhaps become one with it. While we don't know what happened with Antoine for his transformation to take place, it's clear what one of his big hobbies is from the anime posters on his room's walls and the manga you can nab from his home, making it all the more noteworthy that his transformation seems to have turned him into what looks suspiciously like Kamen Rider, an insect-themed superhero who many anime and manga fans will be very familiar with. As such, it seems Antoine may have also been on some level delighted with his new shape, even if we never get to interact with him in any way other than gently getting our bones destroyed by his counterattacks. While it's perhaps not their life stream, the people who are fused to machines and vehicles that are scattered throughout the apartment complex, like so many infinitely troubling rejected Transformer robot designs, make sense conceptually on the same level, as they fused with what was closest to them, sure, but they also fused with what they were focused on at the time, and what they were no doubt thinking about doing, with their butchered Voltron look technically being an upgrade in this regard. Okay, being turned into a furnace is just about anyone's nightmare, outside of a very, very specific niche part of the internet that I'm pretty sure I can't show any reference photos of right now. But it does mean any mysteries about how to fix the furnace you were working on are solved, and that you have control over it now like you wouldn't believe, though I definitely wouldn't recommend it. A lot of the bosses of Look Outside follow along the same lines. In fact, the bosses are a big part of what makes this concept seem more viable overall. A lot of the concepts I'm about to delve into here are indeed the least subtle part of the game, as it's perhaps not absolutely groundbreaking of me to say that the stargazer form that our unfortunate neighbour Edwin shifts into is reflective of his fixation on looking up at the stars through his telescope, as can be understood by reading the early entries in his diary. I also doubt you are going to gasp with sheer surprise if I mention that the enemy known as Taxidermy, who made a series of haunting taxidermy animals that I will see whenever I close my eyes now, may have taken that shape because they loved taxidermy. Or that our funky, lift-obsessed friend, the elevator thing, was obsessed with elevators. You are welcome to pretend to be surprised to boost my ego, though, and although I cannot see or know it, I will be very grateful for the assist. There are some harder-to-read scenarios I also think come under this umbrella. While the rest of the Teeth family don't seem to have been stoked enough about their molars to transform into the state we see them in-game, we do learn that they experienced this fate after the family's baby, Rosie, looked outside and transformed. Rosie is described as having been struggling with teething, and subsequently with biting her family to try and relieve the discomfort she was feeling. Rosie wanting nothing more than to be done with her teeth growing seems to explain why she suffers being altered into the form we see her in-game, and why her family also subsequently are changed in this way from Rosie's bites. Inversely, Fred's art becomes literally lifelike, in the sense his paintings actively come to life, although I'm sure part of his hopes and dreams about making art wasn't that said art would steal his face, as it indeed does. Kaylee is transformed into a creature that is basically a humanoid lockpick. After her final act before looking outside is to pick the lock on the door her friend is behind, seemingly believing her friend is having a medical emergency, and thus no doubt thinking about being grateful she can lockpick doors, and possibly wishing she could do so faster, in the milliseconds before the light of the outside world hit her eyes, and she was changed for good. Indeed, even our boy, main protagonist Sam, seems to be beholden to the same concept throughout his story. First and foremost in that two of the potential fates you can face in the game, from creatures who have transformed in order to try and protect themselves from the stresses and dangers of the world, see you fuse with them, leading to some truly awful endings. But endings that appear to reflect Sam's own fears of the world as it currently is. And also as it was before all of this happened in the first place. As a seemingly down-on-his-luck fella who looked set to not be able to pay his rent for the next month had it not been for the end of the world as we know it. For example, Spine's efforts to whisk you away from the dangers of the world via some deeply, deeply questionable adjustments to your body, which seem to effectively take you from having a human body into being a bundle of nerve endings that more closely resemble a slinky to some degree, are most troubling not just because the description of what happens to you is straight up on the level of I have no mouth and I must scream in terms of harrowing implications, but also because the final moment reveals a bleak truth, as Sam says that Spine was right, appearing to reference the character just beforehand saying, "Just let me work. You will love this. Just trust me. This is right. This is for the best." Of course, there's a very real chance Sam is thinking this because he's been made into a fleshy pretzel with Frankenstein magic, and that has no doubt affected what parts of his brain are actually left to do some thinking for him. But I actually think this ends up being one of the more lastingly horrific feeling endings to the game, ironically because Sam isn't in pain, or sad in it. There's something about this conclusion theoretically having all the trappings of a happy ending conceptually, with Sam's fears and struggles having been addressed, and his loneliness getting a seemingly permanent fix, that makes the Spine ending so much worse. Much in the same way all of these previously mentioned transformations feel worse because so many of them are, at least in theory, what the people in question wanted. Or at least are their goals and dreams and motivations taken to a different kind of level. Now, I do want to talk about how the main endings of the game follow along with this concept too, so this is a warning that the next few minutes of this video will be very spoiler heavy in that regard. I will add a timestamp to skip this section for anyone who wants to experience these endings by themselves, if only because some of them are so downright hog wild, I do think many people will have to play them for themselves in order to fully believe they're real. It's hard to talk about the concept of Look Outside's transformations reflecting the horror of the idea of getting what you think you want, and it either being a monkey's paw-like story situation where what you wanted came with grim caveats, or it outright showing that what you wanted isn't what you needed, without talking about the game's endings and their meanings. This is first and foremost because we learn in the Unity ending that the uber-awful secret truth that Sybil is keeping hidden, at all costs, to the extent that she wipes her own memory if we remind her about it in the game, and tries to kill us if we follow it up, is that the entirety of humanity and the Earth itself is an extension of the visitor that lingers above in the sky, with the enormity of this mind-boggling reveal being something that naturally warps the minds of those who actually learn it. With this in mind, the idea these transformations aren't intended to be punishments actually makes a lot of practical sense in universe, since it only stands to reason that the visitor would seek to grant the wishes and hopes of those who see it and it sees. Since, though the visitor recognises there are differences between it and humanity when you talk to it, this is still to some degree the cosmic equivalent of trying to soothe an aching limb, or putting a bandage on a wounded finger. However, given the one thing emphasised about the visitor in every ending is that it's entirely alien to us, any efforts it may make to help others are made without any context of what a person really wants, or why they may not want to be made into a screaming conga line of attached clones of themselves, even if they do want to be able to do more at once. After all, what's the problem if a bunch of people are forcibly joined into a nightmarish form to an alien that thinks we might all be part of its own body? It'd probably be the same as seeing your fingers joined onto your hands to some degree, and indeed, in the ending where you begin to revert into the visitor's form, you express no fears or concerns about everyone and everything you know gently melting together like Play-Doh in the hot sun. It's very much akin to the ant comparison I offered at the very beginning of this video, as while I think returning insects to where they come might bring them solace, I have very little way of knowing whether I actually helped them, or whether I accidentally created ant trauma for generations of their lineage. This idea is reflected in the difference between the various ways the game's ending transforms various characters, and how they handle these transformations. Every transformation that happens is exclusively horrifying enough that they're the kind of thing I would have been obsessed with as an edgy teen artist, sure, but they're in line enough to hold weight. If you're able to give the astronomers the right objects to help connect them to the visitor properly, by giving them an actual accurate account of the creature, albeit one that doesn't feature Sybil's secret nightmarish knowledge, and are able to help them through their awkward Cthulhu puberty by lovingly, caringly beating them up a little, the world can be saved and redeemed from its current nightmarish state. Similarly, in the endings wherein you speak to the visitor, the creature is remarkably supportive given everything that's come before now, and is actively apologetic at the damage they've caused, explaining they'd simply never seen life like humanity beforehand, and thus didn't know the damage they were causing, and will even leave in order to prevent further damage. The visitors offer to show you their true form, even though this is sort of obviously going to break Sam's mind, is a prime example of the entity simply not understanding the contrasts between their own nature and humanity's. I think there are a lot of different ways you can interpret this, but it does suggest having a better idea of the visitor, and thus a better way to commune with it, can help these transformations actually do what the person wants. Though this is still pretty damn nightmarish for Sam in the endings where he goes to see the visitor himself, since he gets turned into a new form that reflects its own shape. Though you could argue that said new form is one the visitor would consider a true blessing, as it allows Sam to essentially decide the fate of the world single-handedly when he still has the cognitive capacity to do so. Or I guess many-handedly, really. This concept also goes some way to explain why Sybil's own transformation is as expansive, and as hard to fight against, as it is in the game. As the first person to spot the visitor, it does seem Sybil has a bit of a proverbial head start on the whole, going from a human being to a creature that looks like a vat of fleshy jelly thing. But perhaps more importantly, her desire to protect everyone from what she has learned and act as a barrier between the visitor and the people of Earth means it also makes sense that her transformation is such a huge one, and one wherein she seemingly warps reality to create an entire replica meat world made from her body, where her organs are other sentient beings that add extra hurdles for anyone foolish enough to try and stand against her. Like us in the Unity ending, for example. Although the secret true ending is a total gag ending, the implication of the way it unfolds does work on a similar level, with Sam's hours of playing a Final Fantasy-like RPG game apparently being enough to let him convince the visitor of his own version of reality, wherein Sam is powerful enough to destroy the visitor with one suitably anime-esque attack when all else seems lost. Given Sam is also part of the visitor, this does make sense, though funnily enough, this path would give him theoretically absolutely no way of knowing as much. So we've sorted through the roster of goopy and fleshy rebirths, and delved a little into why many of them reflect a dark irony in terms of people getting, air quotes, what they want. Of course, after delving into all of this, perhaps a more interesting question emerges in terms of the why here, or at least what the significance is regarding this theme of the game. A lot of horror and Lovecraft-inspired mythos explores the idea of a creature that's so removed from our own reality that it is able to destroy our minds and bodies without even seeming entirely malicious in intent. But I don't know that I've ever seen it be explored in quite so much depth, and in such a compelling way, other than perhaps in some striking SCP stories. Look Outside, I think, is able to access horror in a way that is as engrossing as it is, because it's not about some vicious serial killer or human-hating alien hunting down the protagonists. But there are certainly segments that delve into this territory. Instead, as referenced before, the idea of focusing on a scenario that is terrifying because you aren't the subject of some malicious entity or evil plot is harrowing on entirely different levels, as it's not about good versus evil, but a matter of surviving in a world wherein you can possibly be turned into a sentient assortment of frubes because you really wanted a yogurt when you opened your curtains one fateful morning. That said, a lot of what works to me best about the way Look Outside takes the hopes, dreams, and purposes of a range of characters, and shows that these motivations can also be horrific, is that it takes one of the things that usually drives people most, and shows that even this usually sacred purpose can be corrupted just as easily as everything else with the right tools. This is immediately fascinating in terms of being a sort of corruption of hope, but interestingly, also works the other way, as we see a range of people who are able to persist, and in some ways thrive despite it all, even when their life's primary goal has been warped into their worst nightmare. Particularly as the motley crew Sam can assemble over the course of the game take care of one another in their own ways, and find new purpose in the bonds they build along the way. Indeed, in cases like Summer, whose transformation is based around her anxieties and desire to hide away from the world, undergoing this metamorphosis can actually help some characters realise that what they really wanted was something quite different all along. In this sense, despite Look Outside being one of the most uniquely and wonderfully diabolical horror games I think I've ever played, the way the game explores the horror around getting what you want in this world, and unfolds it into showing the solace of these characters getting what they need, be that a friend, a sandwich, or a merciful chainsaw to the jugular, is oddly beautiful. If only because here, I can know what one roster of insects wants, albeit through some sentient talking roaches explaining they're having a civil war in my bathroom while I'm making them dinner. Life finds a way, I guess. This was supposed to be a way shorter video I made between some larger projects, so I got carried away with just how fun the game and this topic are to talk about, and with delving into some characters I genuinely think you couldn't get to meet in basically any game that isn't Look Outside. As such, I'd like to say a huge thanks to anyone who made it this far, and mention that I would love to hear any other people's thoughts and theories about the game in the comments if you have any, as I think there are a lot of different ways Look Outside's story and characters can be interpreted, and the idea and theories in this video are just some of them, though some I find make the game even more interesting than it already was. Thanks again for watching, and I hope you have a good day whenever you watch this, or at least that you've not been turned into a sentient kidney or an angry fungus person.